Tonight, on the CBS Late Movie, chilling suspense as apes reveal the truth about the fate of mankind.
Hi, this is Dan. Today we're going to be talking about another challenge that is facing the entertainment industry, and that is the very nature of streaming. One of the biggest challenges that the entertainment industry is only now coming really to terms with, even though it's very, very late in the game, is the simple nature of streaming and what it has done to the entire concept of what a movie or a TV show is. Let's face it, in the old days, the studios were an oligopoly, which means there were very, very few studios around that were delivering motion pictures. Even if you include the small independents, such as the Republics or the PCRs, or for a while there, the Columbia Pictures, you still only had a limited number of providers, as well as a limited number of theaters. Therefore, you had a captive audience for all of your movies and TV shows. Similarly, in the early days of television, you only had a couple of networks, and in many areas, you might have only had one station. So once again, you had a captive audience. And even if you had a TV show on the least popular of the networks, which at that time was ABC, you still had approximately 25% of the audience. So you still had an enormous amount of influence. When you mentioned that you were watching a hit TV show, whether it be an All in the Family or a Friends or a Simpsons, you were in pretty good company because a very large percentage of the population would have been watching those shows as well, even if you were having more and more stations entering the fray. When you saw the arrival of home video, it initially was very limited by the very nature of how much it cost, but it still drove an increase in interest in Hollywood's past, as well as new movies. And you saw big increases in the amount of interest the public had in going to see the movies, and then eventually renting the videotapes, or in many instances buying them as well. The collector's mentality was kicking in, but it was still fairly limited because of the cost of the equipment, and it remains something that was desirable. Even when you add to that the early days of premium cable, not all markets had premium cable, and you only had HBO for a while. So it had the entire world to itself. As you increased the number of cable stations, you ran into a problem that we're seeing today. And that is that in spite of there being a lot more stations, that did not mean you could have a great diversity of content. At that time, there was even talk among the very, very idealistic that you would eventually have a channel that could be devoted only to great ballet and opera performances. And in fact, that was even tried for a while to greatly disastrous effects. Although those stations eventually switched around, embraced reality and documentaries, and they found a nice balance. But it was still something where you still had a limited number of channels, and because things were linear, you still had to watch the program when it was on, or maybe figure out how to use your video cassette recorder to record it so you could watch it later. Fact is, the majority of VCRs never stopped having the blinking 12.00, meaning 12 o'clock, because people never figured out how to use the timer. So that really wasn't as big a concern as initially thought it could be. So you were still watching the programs when they were on, and you had to catch them, because if you missed them, they were gone. That you couldn't just say, well, I'll watch that next week. As we know, with the arrival of DVRs and all of that got a little bit changed. TiVo helped with it a bit, but it was still very linearly based. And sure enough, if you recorded a program to be watched later, whether it was on VCR or whether it was on a DVR, the bottom line was, if you didn't watch it within a week, there was a very good chance you would never watch it. In fact, that percentage was well over 90%. If you didn't watch it within the first 3 days, you weren't going to watch it, most likely. Now let's get to streaming. What was the difference with streaming? Streaming made it convenient because not only could you binge watch something without having to record every single episode, use delayed gratification, and then binge it, but you could binge it all at once. However, there was a poison pill to this, and that was that project, that title, would be there forever. So therefore, there was no time pressure of going to see it. So because of that, no program beyond the initial rush of everyone watching it had any kind of sustainability in terms of the public sphere. This was exacerbated by the fact that series no longer were on every week, that you would have a limited number of episodes, usually between 6 and 10, and that there could be between a year to 2 years before you got another season. Plenty of time for people to forget it. Plenty of time for you as a creator to screw it up and thereby ruin any kind of residual value that it would have. Moreover, because you had the content not being linear, because you had so much that was sitting there in perpetuity, the value of each individual title dropped precipitously because it was always there, and familiarity breeds contempt. There was no pressure, there was no exclusivity beyond the first week where there was any kind of dopamine hit for seeing something. So therefore, you had an eternal amount of program titles sitting there, but you didn't necessarily have any kind of exclusivity with it, nor did you have any kind of pressure to actually ever see it. So therefore, the individual titles became very amorphous and very unimportant on an individual level. Yes, there were certain groundbreaking shows that came out in this period, notably the AMC revolution with shows such as Mad Men and Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and Walking Dead. But notice that was on a basic cable channel, and it was still linear. So it was still playing by old school rules of having a delay, having it be something that was on at a set time, wasn't necessarily always available at your convenience. So it didn't become the equivalent of toothpaste or potato chips. It still remained with a certain amount of cultural cachet. Add to that the fact that much of new Hollywood is coming in from big tech, and big tech is big tech. It does not operate the same way show business does. It is not in the business of selling emotions the way show business is. So therefore, it took on a much more corporate sense of what should be made. So rather than having a really wide diversity of programming, you quickly saw that all of this content became very, very monochromatic and started following very set patterns. And that includes what is the type of story. You'll notice that most streaming series are very self-important and very serious. And they're usually quite dour. You don't watch your average streaming show that has highly adult content, highly violent content, and feel better about life. In fact, you can often feel worse. And since a lot of television viewing was done as a relaxation and was done as a treat, when it carries an element of stress with it, that is lost. And that is another problem that has come up with the streaming model. Moreover, a lot of big tech was very limited in the number of schools that output people who join that world. And so you had an almost hegemony of the type of stories, the type of themes, the type of morals that the programming had. And if you didn't happen to fit within that very narrow niche of wealthy urban elites, you all of a sudden found yourself shut out. And this was brought home very painfully when we saw that certain titles would be released, and as part of the advertising, which was insane, a lot of the marketing was devoted to attacking segments of the audience and making fun of them, or saying that they were deplorable, or that they were disconnected, or they were somehow unworthy. If you are spending northward of $15 million an episode, you cannot afford to not have the widest audience possible. And in fact, that is exactly what's happened, which is why so many movies and TV shows end up underperforming. Because after a while, as a viewer, if you're constantly not going to see something that reflects what you want to see, that reflects your desire to just have a laugh or just watch something that's light and engaging, you're going to go someplace else. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why I discovered, to my shock, that an inordinate percentage of the students that I taught in a high school dual enrollment class, it's a college class taught to high school students, were very familiar with older titles pretty much from my youth, as opposed to being very caught up in the current stuff, and with maybe one or two students caught up in the older stuff. That said something to me. It said that for some reason, this older content, and I don't know where they're seeing it. I don't know if it's because you go visit your older folks, and they happen to have it on a linear channel, and you just happen to be stuck there because they're acting as babies or whatever. But somehow they saw that, and that has made enough of an impression where something that was made 40 or 50 years ago still has truck with them, as opposed to them, in terms of current material, being rather stuck on the YouTube and TikTok and all of that. Not saying that us older folks aren't equally stuck on it, but this is presenting a problem to Hollywood. If so many people, whether it be my demographic or whether it be people who were born after 2005, that all of them are equally watching the same kind of content, and it's not focused on the Netflix and the Disney Pluses and all of that as much as those companies need them to be, given their spends. We're looking at a serious problem. Is there a solution to this? Of course there is. There's always a solution. The question is whether the executives in charge are willing to go for it. Now, we've obviously seen Netflix and NBC Universal, and to some degree Paramount and Sony, but you're still seeing lacks in other places where there is still almost a disconnect between who is deciding what projects should be greenlit and the ultimate audience it's going to. And if something is a commodity now, it's very easy for it to be disregarded shortly thereafter. So it behooves the entertainment industry to look seriously at Barbie, Oppenheimer, and a lot of the other movies that have not only been successful, but the ones that have failed. And not only have they failed, but they've failed without being bad movies. This is a key, that if you have something that fails and it's a bad movie, it doesn't mean anything. If you see something that's wildly successful, most of the time, if it's a good movie, it also doesn't really mean that much. It's when you see something that's on the fringes that way overperforms. Now, I'm not saying Barbie and Oppenheimer are in any way fringe, except for the fact that they're part of a genre of films that is fringe now, and that is the traditional Hollywood A picture, where there's an emotional context, where it's not about CGI bling, it's about more human emotions. I'm not saying there's not a lot of CGI in them. I'm just saying that the CGI is not the advertised attraction. It is the story. It is the characters. It is the situation And in many cases, it is also in some ways the message that the individual viewers take from them. And look at how both Oppenheimer and Barbie have different interpretations depending on where the audience falls culturally and politically. It's fascinating because you're seeing a cross-cultural embracing of both of those movies, but for very different reasons among very different audience segments. So that's a good sign. But those are movies that are exceptions right now. It really is clear, looking at the linear channels, which are still 60% of the overall viewership, looking at the linear channels, what are they connecting to with audiences? Look at the streaming channels. What are the hits that no one expected to be hits? Now, I'm going to give you some examples. The fact that bread and butter Korean continuing dramas, the telenovelas of Korea, are doing exceptionally well. And so was that show, that show 10% about talent agents, and it's a French show. I mean, the talent agents are secretly very American or old school American and very British. They're not really French, but it still connects with an American audience in a much larger way than was expected. So you're seeing these non-conforming programs starting to do exceptionally well. Look at the number of people who, because of RRR, are now fascinated with Indian movies. Although I have to say that I wish that more people would be interested in Bollywood horror, because I got to tell you, that's one of my favorite genres, and I find that there's not that many people I can discuss it with. But yes, these are signs that the audience is craving something it's not getting domestically. So take a look at those things for those who are looking to enter the industry, and those are where the opportunities are going to be. Hopefully the strikes will settle soon. I've got to say, I was very disappointed with the way the Writers Guild, the day before the negotiations were supposed to resume, decided to go on an all-out attack. I have no idea what that was about. That was counterproductive in the extreme. So we'll see. We'll see. The jury's still out. So as the earnings reports start trickling in, we've already heard Warner Brothers, we've heard NBC Universal, and now we're waiting to hear Disney. So this is going to be a very interesting couple of weeks, and we will discuss what the earnings report as a whole say once most of them are in. Have fun at the movies.